Ghost of Elkridge. A novel. By Harris Stevens. A work in progress. Copyright 2022 Harris Stevens. Part 1. Daughters of Drunken Fathers and Dead Mothers. Prologue. When was it? The first time or the last? His stone-cold gaze and the hand that followed. Most beasts that young children fear live outside, trying to gain entrance. Mine lived inside and within me. My father, or perhaps in American Gothic vernacular, was a lion tamer for sure, and I, the wayward cub, arguably always in need of correction. Sometimes I called out or screamed for Mam, but I mostly knew that though she may have been in the somewhere, looking down at me, she couldn't help. At least it was a curious comfort to evoke my last memories of Mam. Her peaceful, gentle countenance surrounded by a cacophony of white roses, lilies, condolence and remembrance cards, while the soft, unmemorable tinny music from a wind-up Victrola played in the background trying to fill the void of silence, but not quite. In reality, I don't remember much about my mother. I was just about 2 when she died. That final scene that I sometimes conjured up was only my fancy, an impression I am sure that I must have acquired along the ways of my childhood. You know, the mixed-up memories, real or unreal, that adults must manufacture in order to gain a semblance of reconciliation with the past. Thinking back on it, I am not even sure how my mother had died. My Grammy, whose real name was Violet, had once said, though she never spoke about it much, that Mam died of a broken heart. I can still recall sitting on her knee, and in my little mind picturing some city doctors trying to glue it all back together. Grammy, or Grams I oft called her for short, in turn would call me Ghost Girl, cause in her words I was just skin and bones, and white as a sheet. This even more apparent when set against my raven black page boy hair with eyes to match. More ghost than girl, she would say somewhat wistfully while looking me over up and down as if I were some mangy dog that one day wandered into her yard looking for a scrap of food. I accepted my nickname willingly, but not the condition that I was named for. Most of what follows happened in the eve of my 11th year. The year Mam and I started conversing. 1. My best friend Sadie said the gossip was that Mam was killed by my father, but I more or less thought this couldn't be true, and she only said so because that's how her mother was murdered. And so it was said that when Mr. Wilkes came home 3 a.m. one night intoxicated, he strangled her to death in a drunken rage. Sadie Wilkes' claim to fame or infamy was that she was a distant relation to John Wilkes Booth, who had assassinated Abraham Lincoln in 1865. She had told me in confidence that she didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed having 2 murderers in the family. She was smart too. Not school smarts, but she knew how to get both into and out of trouble whenever it pleased her. That kind of smart. Sadie was turning 11 when I was 10, but she didn't hold that against me. She was half a head taller though, and already starting to fill out. You couldn't tell much at first, how she was growing out of her childhood little by little. In the warm months we would oft go down river to skinny dip. Sadie and I would strip to our undergarments, basically undershirts and step-ins, which was as much as we dared. When we came out of the water our underthings clung to us like a second skin. I could already see the slight swelling of her chest and the dark shadow of approaching womanhood below. In contrast, I was flat as a dance floor, smooth, and as bare as a baby's bottom. Sadie tried consoling me, saying that my chest was beginning to poke out a little, and it did seem to be straining a bit against the cotton of my soaking wet clothes. Still, it was a sore point for certain, and not much I could do about except wait. At least she didn't rub it in like Grams had when she named me Ghost Girl. Besides having 2 murderers in her family, Sadie herself could be downright weird. For example, she was always singing Christmas carols, even in the summer. Her favorite song was Jingle Bells, which she sang constantly. This was positively annoying, and used to instigate great debates between us about what you could and couldn't do. A good tune is still a good tune no matter when you sing it, she would say, defending herself between choruses of Jingle All the Way. And I really didn't have much of an argument against that. See, I told you she was smart. I thought about Mam a lot then. Sometimes I would rub my finger across the edges of the bumpy whiteboarded snapshots that Paps had taken with the beloved Voigtlander he got off a dead German soldier during the Great War. Grams would oft tell me about the war, and that Paps returning from it had changed, and how even after all these years, it still festered inside him like a shrapnel shell waiting to explode at any moment. I would wonder why they called it the Great War. How could it be so great with all the dying, wounded and such laying around on some foreign battlefield with an unpronounceable name? After the war, Pabst made his living selling insurance because, as he liked to tell it, unlike most folks who never gave it a second thought, he knew all about mortality. 2. Would it shock you if I said that Pabst once tried to, as he told it, love me, and that I was partially disappointed when he didn't? But before I get into all that, I suppose I should say something about my history, as it were. The name on my birth certificate said Madeline Blair, but I was always called Maddie before Grams renamed me. I was born October 29, 1929 in Baltimore City. Maybe some of you know that October 29th was the day of the big crash. The stock market had fallen apart, plunging most of America into the Great Depression. I did not understand any of this at my age, except it was bad for most folks. I can recall imaging what the event must have been like, thinking about all those tall buildings in New York City that I had seen in pictures crashing down and collapsing in a heap into a big hole in the earth. How that had happened I don't think I ventured a guess, though I was sure that the wrath of God might have played a part. Sadie, who among other things, was a God-fearing girl, would always tell me so when we considered doing something wicked. Grams told me once that life had given my Paps 2 strong blows. The first one, a punch to the stomach, being his trials in the Great War, and the second, an uppercut to the jaw, was the Great Depression. I knew that Paps had blamed the crash of '29 for losing his job, and was always spouting off about it, but I later found out that he had really lost his job about a year prior for a variety of reasons, being intoxicated, missing appointment and such. Once Paps was so inebriated that he ended up driving 200 miles to the wrong city to meet a client. I also learned, according to Grams, that one day long before I was even born, he had come home wailing and seething, carrying on while waving a piece of paper in Mam's face later on, seeing it among a stack of papers that Grams kept in the old secretary next to the sofa. I was curious that such a piece of bad news was saved as if it were an award or something to be proud of. From what I remember it said, "Your services with this company are no longer required," along with some other stuff I did not concern myself about. Though he never said it out loud, I knew that my birth and all the misfortunes that followed were somehow linked together in Pap's mind, all jumbled up inside. And then was that word great again. Why did people insist on calling such bad things great? During this time Mams and Paps still lived in Baltimore. They owned a red brick row house on a nice tree-lined street. Or was it a white Queen Anne with the obligatory picket fence? I was really too young then to remember, but there were the 2 photographs in a old brown leather album Grams kept on a dusty shelf near the mantel. She would let me take down once in a while, but only with her strict supervision. So, as I was saying, in one of the photographs was Mam, young, pretty with a beaming smile and soft auburn hair running down the sides of her face in tight ringlets. Her hair looking almost blonde due to the harshness of the sunlight and gentle browning of the snapshot. Paps wasn't in the photo, but I guessed he was the one who took the picture after all. This was the one in front of the red brick row house. Of course the photo was in black and white, but in my mind I just knew the bricks were red. In the second picture was Mam, holding a swaddled newborn which Grams said was me right after my mother returned from the hospital. Paps, and a younger looking Grams, in front of a white Queen Anne house with matching picket fence in the background. I knew nothing about architecture for sure, but Grams told me the house was a Queen Anne Victorian, which made me quite proud to think that we used to live in the house of a queen. I first remember seeing the photograph when I was quite younger than I am now, and I asked Grams, who took the photograph. She replied rather vaguely, "Your mom's dad took it, but don't pay it no mind." "You mean I had a grandpa? You were married then?" I said, as if this revelation was unusual. For some reason I never asked nor seemed concerned about the male lineage of my family, even Paps's side. "Of course I was married to your grandpa, child. How on earth do you think you and your mam came into this world?" Grams looked down at me with a mixture of scorn and bemusement. She caught herself for a moment, as if calling her daughter Mam was my personal province that she intruded on. "Ghost, as keen as you are to book learning, you really can be a stupid child sometimes." Grams paused, reflecting on the matter, and I guess remembering my age, she knew I wasn't aware of such things. In those days, families didn't talk much about the birds and the bees. Most kids then, including me, learned from each other, rightly or wrongly. I learned some from Sadie, but I'll get into that later on. Anyway, it seems something happened long before I was born that Grams didn't much want to speak about. So even though I was only a little kid, I had sense enough to drop the subject as Grams surely didn't take to further discussion about the matter. Grams was like that. She would talk a storm about some things, but would find ways to avoid talking about others. As much as I loved her, there were times I realized that I really couldn't figure Grams out. The way she would prattle on one day, and other days try to whisk me out of the house with her broom when I overstepped some mysterious boundary that only she was aware of. Yes, Grams set the rules mostly, except when Paps was home, which weren't oft. Now that I think about it, to get her talking about our family's past was hard as keepin' mosquitoes from biting in the summertime down by the river. Over the years bits and pieces would gradually come out, and most of it was not exactly the happiest of memories, truth be told. Soon after Paps lost his job, due to circumstances and such, the three of us had to move from Baltimore to live with Grams in Elkridge, a bump of a town nestled in the heart of the Patapsco River Valley on the outskirts of the city. But unlike the hubbub of city life, it was a quiet place where nothing much had happened of great import for a long time, since the Civil War at least. Even now in 1939, with the papers saying that a new war was imminent in Europe, in Elkridge, the glory days of the Civil War still lingered along with the Victorian frame of mind that came with it. It was as if time had stopped along the bank of the river to rest a bit while the outside world went on about its business. I venture there were a lot of small towns like Elkridge scattered around. Even though Maryland remained in the Union, it had, at its heart, Southern sympathies, especially in the more rural areas. The soul of the community was the Patapsco River itself, which was really a bunch of meandering tributaries and inlets that wound the way down the valley, through the heart of Baltimore, and finally emptying into the Chesapeake. Grams and her family were originally from Kentucky though. But much I knew. She was born in late autumn 1869. The exact day of her birth seemed to change from year to year. This made it pretty hard to celebrate her birthday, but Grams said that it was all stuff and nonsense anyway, and wouldn't be bothered with something only a know-nothing child could be happy about. She never forgot my birthdays, however, not that those days were all that much out of the ordinary. For my 10th birthday, somehow Grams persuaded Paps, who was in one of his more sober and gracious moments, to chip in and buy me a copy of the poems of Emily Dickinson, who was my all-time favorite poet. I carried that book around almost everywhere, the way some girls did the dolls, and I guess I used to confound Sadie when she got to singing one of her carols by reciting one of Miss Dickinson's little verses. Who has not found the heaven below will fail of it above. I might point out at this time that Mam was born in 1899, so it was a curious fact indeed, at least to me, that all the Blair women were born in a year ending in 9. I could never set my mind straight about the importance of this, so I finally decided, due to the circumstances, that it must be considered more bad than good. In 1878, when Grams was around 9, there's that number 9 again, her family moved out west. Maybe that's why we Blairs had an unusual way of talking. It was though little bits of regional colloquialisms had been collected along the way and taken hold, each fighting for the rightful order like a tug-o-war of words in our way of speaking. Though the Transcontinental Railroad had been running for a few years, money was tight and the train fares plus the cost transporting all the worldly possessions had Graham's family, a group of lapsed Mennonites, decide to join up with some displaced Mormons. The plan was to travel the old Oregon Trail in a bunch of raggedy Civil War surplus wagons they had purchased for cheap. As you will later see, this was key to her survival. Being a small child, and with the passage of time, Grams could not remember the destination of the journey. All she knew was that she ended up alone in San Francisco, Frisco as she called it, and that's how I got Sarah. 3. By the time I entered 4th grade I had learned pretty much about American history, especially the Civil War and the Old West, which were my favorite times. So when Grams was in one of her talking moods, I would just love snuggling up in her lap while she spoke about whatever came into her mind. On this particular day we were sitting on the porch late one particularly hot summer afternoon. I was sort of slouching half on and off Graham's lap without a care in the world, oblivious to my disheveled hair, matted by sweat, and the fact that my thin cotton print summer dress was sort of sliding unladylike up my thighs. Just staring absent-minded at the flaking and crackled whitewash that sure needed some fixin', smelling the incongruent scents of Graham's sweet toilet water and the hot stickiness with its musky odor. waiting for Grams to get talkative. I know Grams had been after Paps to do something about painting and fixin'. She never could quite catch hold of him as he seemed like a demonic whirlwind, in and out of the house as if we had one of those brass department store revolving doors that I saw in the moving pictures sometimes. After losing his job selling insurance, Paps set himself up as a jack of all trades, something his experience in the army had a part in. It really would stick in Graham's craw that Paps had time to go about fixing other people's things, but always had something else to do better when it came to fixin' his own. Still, he did help out in paying the bills, so Grams couldn't fault him much, and usually just resorted to cursing or muttering some under her breath. I would hear her say, more than I cared to listen, "Lord, one day I have a mind to catch that father of yours by the belt and haul his good ver nothing ass out to the tool shed to do something useful, never minding a swear word or two in front of me, especially if it concerned Paps." Course the same thing didn't apply in my case, cause when I had the urge to act growed up and do a bit of swearing on my own, I felt the hot sting of Graham's open hand on my bottom as swift as you could say Jack Robinson. Somehow, that whack on my behind didn't faze me near as much as when Paps saw fit to WUP me. Paps hit way harder and more persistent than Graham's did, but it was more than that. I sensed love behind Graham's hand, but only the heavy burden of life and self-pity when Paps lay into me. I tolerated Paps more or less. I guess I must have loved him some, in the way children always do. Maybe it was hope, maybe I was searching for acknowledgement or redemption. If I am to be truthful, Paps wasn't always like that, not the monster you'd might be thinking. While being loving and out-and-out kindness might have been a stretch, when he wasn't drinking he actually could be quite sociable, and had a droll sort of humor in him. My mind flipped back to hear Graham's soft droning on about something or other, so I looked up at her batting my dark doe eyes for effect. "Tell me about when you were my age, about going to California." By this time, I guess I should say right here, that if your head is in a bit of a whirl because my narrative seems to bounce around from place to place, it is because that is the way I think, the way I remember. The little bits and pieces that just seem to pop into my head, wedging the way between the more linear grown-up-like thoughts. I believe that most children think this way. Old people too sometimes digress, wander around a bit in the heads before coming back to the original point. Sort of like the river itself, wandering aimlessly and branching off with no rhyme or reason wherever it pleased. Maybe that's why we had such a strong bond and why I might have been unconsciously influenced by Grams, who could weave a spider's web of a tale, so complicated that even it would have trouble figuring out the beginning from the end. Other than spending my free time with Grams as Sadie, my main passion was reading. I used to go down Main Street and sit in the free library to peruse whatever seemed interesting. Though I sometimes brought books home, I liked the quiet serenity of the place, the occasional noise of some quiet footsteps, a stifled cough, and the low humming of the ceiling fans above. It was comforting to know that other people were there too, enjoying the same things as me. My two favorite stories at this time were Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Huckleberry Finn. While Alice was a children's book, Huckleberry Finn was considered controversial reading to many, especially in the South. It was deemed inappropriate for youngsters, so I had to quietly sneak into the adult section to read the unabridged copy. The reason I liked these particular books so much is that they were about children, more or less my age, who had amazing experiences, and weren't afraid to speak their minds, even standing up to adults. I guess you could call them free spirits. I so wished I could be like Huck, whose journey down the Mississippi River was ever so more adventurous than spending days dangling my feet in the Patapsco. I also must confess that I occasionally wanted to call myself Sarah Williams and have old Jim be my father, even though he was a Negro slave. 4. I looked up at Grams, while she slowly sucked in her breath and held it for a moment before speaking, as if there were so much to tell, and too much hurt behind the memories. When I was about your age more or less, my mama and papa joined up with a bunch of travelers going to the Western Territories. We traveled part ways from Kentucky, crossing the Mississippi alone, just mama, papa and me, until we met up with them other folks in Independence. There were about 5 or 6 families altogether. When Graham's recollections really took hold, I could almost see it through her eyes like a movie's how. I looked up over my shoulder again and noticed that her eyes had glazed over, a solitary tear making its way down her cheekbone as she recalled those events not yet a lifetime old, but of a world that had come and gone and didn't exist anymore. I sunk back into her warmth, not caring that it only added to my discomfort in the stiflingly summer heat, feeling the slow rhythmic pulse of her heartbeat and the wetness of her breath upon my neck. Grams continued, I don't remember much happening for most of the ways. A wagon or two broke down here and there, and then she cursed under her breath how if them had been Union wagons, they might have held up better. The wagons were not the typical sort that had been made for family travel, but army supply wagons that had makeshift canvas frames around them, like squared-off tents on top. I mostly remember the bumping and grinding of the wagon along the trail, she sighed, and the foul mud which then gave way to interminable dust that got into most everything when we hit the plains. No, just being wet, dusty, and hungry in turn for the most part. She then went on explaining to me the daily routine and how she made friends with a little girl around 7 years old named Sarah who was from one of the Mormon families. During the following days, which led to weeks, Grams, or Violet as she was known then, did her chores and played with little Sarah when time permitted. It seemed like a pretty mundane existence with only hard work and hunger to fill the monotony. Violet and Sarah were the only young children in the group, except for some boys around 14 or 15 which in those days were considered more men than boys. That all changed after the heavy rains they encountered while deep into the prairie. Though they missed the brunt of the flooding, the weather was wet and unsettled for the next day or so. Violet awoke one morning to see the sun just starting to appear above the horizon. She hoped that this was a sign that the weather would finally clear up some and she would have time to play a bit with Sarah, whose favorite game was hide and seek. Violet had just started dressing, pulling the homespun calico dress over her, and was bending down to button up her shoes when she heard loud shouting outside her wagon, mainly from the menfolk. Looking out from a crack where the canvas met the wooden sides of the wagon, she could see up on a ridge a few hundred yards away a small scouting party of about 12 renegade Indian warriors on ponies staring down at them. Most of the Indian tribes had been tamed and sent to live on reservations. A few were more persistent about keeping the way of life and had run away to keep fighting those who crossed into what was once their lands. For a moment they just waited, watching all the commotion below. The horses, heads bobbing, weaving, and occasionally stamping the hooves in anticipation. Men and women rushed around all frantic, the men grabbing rifles or what weapons were available, trying to push or shove the women folk and as children into the sheltered covered parts as best they could. Violet felt herself being helped into a hidden compartment underneath the wagon which had been originally used for storing supplies and accoutrements during wartime. There was little room among the boxes of foodstuffs and various possessions, but she managed to somehow wedge herself between some bags of feed for the horses and piles of sundries. Then all hell broke loose. Without any warning, the Indians suddenly, with rifles raised and war clubs high in the air above their heads, let out blood-curdling war cries, and proceeded to charge full speed down the embankment towards the hapless families. For a moment Violet was transfixed by it all, not really believing it was happening. Of course she had heard about hostile Indians. News of the Little Bighorn massacre was in all the newspapers just 2 years before, and people still talked about it. She couldn't see as much as she could hear, but what she did hear, the loud booms of the gunshots, random screams both from attackers and victims alike, sent her burrowing as best she could under the provisions in the cramped underbelly of the wagon. The last thing she remembered beside the pungent smell of gun smoke and burning wood was someone futilely trying to push little Sarah through the slats of her hiding place. She saw Sarah's hands trying to get a grip, but it was no use, even when Violet tried to reach out and grab onto them. She heard Sarah scream, hands slipping away from the hold, then cries, curses, and silence. By the time it was all over, she had passed out from the sheer horror of it all. 5. Violet awoke to the sounds of men's voices. She shivered with fear and curled up to make herself as small as she could. Slowly it dawned on her that they were speaking English. So they weren't Indians after all. She tried to yell for help, but her mouth was dry as cotton and all that came out was sort of a long moaning sigh. Almost instantly, a pair of large arms scooped her up and put her down beside the wagon. What she saw was something her tender years could not quite understand. The sheer carnage and devastation was almost indescribable. Wagons partially burnt, lifeless bodies bloodied, and worse, both Indian and the victims lay everywhere. She instinctively called out, looking around for her mama and papa, but most of the white dead had already been covered by blankets, or makeshift pieces of material. Other than herself, the only people alive were men in blue uniforms, cavalry soldiers that had been patrolling about 2 miles away and by chance had heard the gunshots way off in the distance. They had arrived too late to help the poor families, but had surprised the Indians who were still searching the wagons for bounty, and picking clean anything they deemed of value. When they saw the soldiers approaching, most had run off to be tracked down later and sorted by a small contingency of the cavalry in hot pursuit. A nice officer with a large bushy moustache saw Violet standing cold and shivering where she had been placed, and quickly put a blanket around her, exclaiming that she was a very lucky girl. Lucky to be alive because the Indians hadn't found her hiding place, and the fact that the wagons could not easily be set on fire due to the wetness of the wooden canvas from the day's prior rains. All Violet could think about was how could she be so lucky when both her parents and all the other innocent people lay dead and murdered. Then Violet began to scream in desperation. She had wanted to see her parents one last time, as the weight and magnitude of it all finally dawned on her. The officer and some of the other soldiers tried to calm her down, but she broke free and ran to the opposite side of the wagon. There, under a hastily thrown section of tarp, was the body of little Sarah, sprawled out on the scrub. She knew it was Sarah because though she couldn't actually see the corpse, she recognized one of the child's hands poking out from under the canvas covering. Beside Sarah's hand, which was curled grotesquely in death, lay her beloved rag doll, dirty and covered with splotches of blood. The soldiers, having caught up with the hysterical child, commenced to pull Violet away, back to Officer's prairie tent set up while they dealt with the whole mess. Just as one of the soldiers touched Violet's shoulder to lead her away, she quickly bent down and retrieved the bloody doll from where it lay. To this day, child, I don't know why I did that, picking up Sarah's doll that rightfully belonged to her, that poor little thing. Grams sighed in remorse, more than one tear wetting her face. My eyes by this time were as big as pie plates, my head spinning with thoughts and emotions that even for me was more confused than ever. Then Grams continued, it's not much use in atoning now, but if I had to give myself a reason, so I could bear the though of it, I guess I must have realized in an instant that sweet Sarah had no use for it anymore, and that soon she would be buried out on the prairie, or in some forgotten grave back east, and that doll was all that would remain of her in the world. Maybe I was selfish, and wanted something of Sarah for myself, so that she wouldn't have truly died, and some part of her would always be with me. Grams made a strange, almost choking-like sound while trying her best to hold back the now flowing tears. I felt a wave of anger go through me, anger towards myself for making Grams relive those horrible memories, rather than let them die with little Sarah out on the prairie. As I was thinking this, Grams abruptly got up off the settee where we had been sitting, but even as she rushed into the house, her gentle hand steadied me so as I wouldn't lose my balance and fall over. Righting myself, I commenced to sit back down on the old wicker, feeling as drained as if I had experienced the account firsthand. I could hear Grams inside, and the heavy thuds of her moving things around, and the squeak of drawers opening. She soon came back on the porch with something in her hands. As Grams came towards me, I could see that she was holding a very curious old rag doll. It had on a mustard-colored homespun dress, a white scarf around the head, no face at all. No eyes, nose or mouth, nothing drawn or painted. I also saw that there were brown spots on it here and there, and I felt dizzy for a moment when I realized it was blood, old, dried and oxidized. Sarah's blood. Grams placed the doll into my hands. This was Sarah's doll that I've kept all these years, she said with a quavering voice. I nodded knowingly, wanting to say something, but the words just stuck in my throat. It's yours now, she said in almost a whisper, and managing a smile to convey to me that it was all right. But why? I said, looking up at her and sensing that it really wasn't all right. Grams looked at me almost annoyed that I wanted to ask a question that couldn't be answered. It's your time now to have it, was all she could respond, and I knew that the time had passed for questions and answers. Grams, trying to bring some normalcy to the situation, asked me what I was going to name it. When I named my dolls, I would usually spend lots of time pondering, just like parents do when naming the kids if they don't already have one in mind. But without any conscious thought or hesitation at all, I blurted out, Sarah. And at that moment Grams and I both knew nothing more needed saying.